is The Rhetoric of Cool by Jeff Rice, who, as you can see, is an ambassador of cool himself. Jeff Rice's main point in this book is to challenge what he called the narrative, or the grand narrative, of 1963, a 3 C's meeting. He felt like all this meeting did was perpetuate some of the traditional concepts of rhetoric and composition. Instead, Rice wants to challenge that, and he feels like that challenge is long overdue. He feels like some of the other voices in the composition field at that time, including those of Amiri Baraka and Marshall McLuhan, were ignored in perpetuating this grand narrative. In order to develop this rhetoric of cool, Jeff Rice has about 6 or so rhetorical elements in his rhetoric of cool. Where we would traditionally think of ethos and pathos and logos, he introduces one of the parts of rhetoric that was left out, and that's the notion of chora, which is one that actually was Plato had founded. In this, chora is the idea of blending together different voices. Outside of the 1963 grand narrative was Amiri Baraka, as we said, defined cool as calm, uninvolved, and detached, and McLuhan, who valued continuity, not continuity, but discontinuity and fragmentation. In a rhetoric of cool, it doesn't match with the lonely, isolated, original thinking writer. A rhetoric of cool includes many different influences that time and place have on composition, what Rice calls chora. Rice feels like the rhetorical tool of appropriation is an invoking of the different chora. He gives an example of Jennifer Granholm's Cool Cities campaign, where she tried to appropriate the images of cool associated with urban culture in order to get people to move back to the cities. He also calls upon or invokes the chora of rap artists or hip-hop artists who use something called sampling, where they sample past authors and artists into their work. He feels like it's an unexpected move as opposed to the expected topos of Aristotelian rhetoric. We call upon different voices as a rhetorical maneuver to get our point across. Another big part of the rhetoric of cool is juxtaposition, or the blending together or finding the right fit in order to depict a complex meaning-making process. Through juxtaposition and through using imagery, we sort of find the right fit, and we make connections that aren't based so much on coherence as they are about the connections themselves, the juxtapositions of these connections. He uses a 1963 movie, again pitting different stories of 1963 against the grand narrative of composition in 1963. A 1963 movie that's called Scorpio Rising, where the opening scene has a drag queen putting on lipstick, while in the background there's a Revlon commercial with a woman putting on lipstick perfectly. That kind of juxtaposition challenges our cultural image, our cultural ideology of beauty, and the naturalness of beauty versus some of the more disturbing factors that disrupt a fragmentation, rhetorical move of juxtaposition to fragment. Perhaps one of the stickier concepts in his rhetoric of cool to me is that of commutation. We move meaning through our signifiers. We move meaning from one to the next, and we can do this through the use of imagery. This picture here depicts a lot of different possible expressions and readings. All of these have meaning, all of these different characters, and they don't make sense in a very rational way that we're used to in traditional rhetoric. Meaning, according to Rice, should occur intuitively more than connectively. Composers juxtapose different chora and appropriate these chora. And it's that movement itself, that commutation, that in fact helps to contribute to the meaning overall. And Jeff Rice talks about, he invokes cultural studies with composition and media. He invokes the voices of Amiri Baraka, jazz artists like John Coltrane, Martin Luther King, and McLuhan, commuting these different individuals in terms of how they contribute to rhetoric and composition. It undermines the logic that we know through these jumps. Elvis as icon, Elvis as Elvis Burger, Elvis as morning talk show hosts. These are the different movements that can be a part of creating meaning or commuting these different images. Nonlinearity is a big part of his Rhetoric of the Cool. Jeff Rice believes that we need to move in a direction that doesn't follow from one step to the next, but it does need to move in a way that is based on the writer and how the writer manipulates these different images and ideas. He uses Jack Kerouac's Big Sur as a movement of through association as opposed to logic. This, in Rice's opinion, is a cool book, or an example of cool writing. McClear exhibits another strange facet of his handsome but faintly decadent Rimbaud-type personality at his summer camp by coming out in the living room with a goddamn hawk on his shoulder. It's his pet hawk, of all things. The hawk is black as night and sits there on his shoulder pecking nastily at a clunk of Hamburg he holds up to it. In fact, the sight of that is so rarely poetic. McClear, whose poetry is really like a black hawk, he's always writing about darkness, dark brown, dark bedrooms, moving curtains, chemical fire, dark pillows, love, beautiful long lines that go across the page irregularly and aptly somehow. So Kerouac moves through association, and this kind of nonlinearity is what will help the field of composition adapt to new forms of media that can enhance our field. And finally, a really important part of a Rhetoric of the Cool is the use of imagery and how we can use imagery to enhance what we have to say. In fact, Rice sort of favors the ability to use imagery as opposed to the ability to explain things in words. Imagery, he argues, complicates meaning and makes more complex statements through the arrangement. In the picture here, we have a black jazz artist whose title of the article is One Flight Up, and in this we see the sort of cultural limitations of the black man who might move up from the bottom floor, but he's still in a dilapidated house. So Rice is arguing that through visual moves, writers extend ideas and feelings in a way that print does not allow for. So what's there to be made of a Rhetoric of Cool? Overall, Rice's ideas are important to whatever direction we, as composition teachers and theorists, are moving, and the opportunities that this affords. However, his examples don't necessarily convince me that this is anything remarkably different than the rhetorical elements that we use. But the fact that he's able to do this in a way that calls attention to things we don't usually pay attention to is worth considering. My main point is that his arguments rely strongly upon the use of different fields. Should a Rhetoric of Cool be included in the narrative? Yes, in our narrative of composition and how it should adapt. However, there are things that we're going to need to communicate and teach that are in line with traditional pedagogy. We don't need an overhauling of the system, but an understanding of how to make cool rhetoric and cool media a part of our composition theory and pedagogy.